What would be a more effective sanction strategy against Russia? Is there one that we should be employing still and haven't done? Is the European Union's, lack of coherency an issue here, or it's overstated? And what do you think is, should we say, are we missing a strategic pairing of better military or diplomatic pressure, for example?
I think the sanctions regime that's in place is very important, and it can continue to be tightened in small ways as we see the loopholes. Every loophole needs attention. Secondary sanctions should be tightened. One of the most important things that can tighten the sanctions regime is not any particular sanction, but something psychological, and that is commitment.
This is The Global Gambit.
Russia is currently in a, difficult situation, let's put it that way. As you may or may have not seen across the channel, Putin and the inner circles of Putin's regime and the elites more broadly are facing increasing amounts of pressure. Indeed, the ex-transport secretary is seemingly no longer with us. And that's because exogenous factors such as sanctions do begin to bite. And sanctions is going to be the topic predominantly of this conversation. How do they work? Do they actually work? And in the case of Russia and Ukraine, are they actually contributing something, or is it more to do with Ukraine's continued resistance? All that coming up. My guest today is Mark Harrison, a prominent economic historian and Emeritus Professor at the University of Warwick, who's also a fellow of the CEPR and the British Academy, and is doing some fantastic work on economic sanctions and warfare with a colleague known as Stephen Broadbury, who I will hopefully have on the show soon. Maybe we could both have you back together, Mark. But it's lovely to have you on. I think the first question I really wanted to ask you is very simply, there's a lot of misunderstanding and I think, false conceptions about what sanctions are and actually how they work, a bit of a lag time effect. So could you give us an overview of exactly what they are, and in the case of Russia, whether they work or not?
Well, there are two countries with an adversarial relationship, and one of them wants to have its way and control the behavior of the other. And one way is to impose damage upon their economy, upon their trade, upon their finance, or upon their access to resources. And if it's done by lawful and peaceful means, then it's sanctions. If it's done with violence, then it's warfare, economic warfare. But I think it's probably useful to bear in mind that first distinction, that economic sanctions belong to peacetime. And indeed, the idea of sanctions really developed out of the experience of World War I, when the victorious Allies perceived that part of the defeat of Germany and the Central Powers had been brought about by means of blockade. And they wanted to build a new and more peaceful world in which aggressors would be restrained. And one way to restrain them might be by threatening economic damage, an economic boycott or a blockade, if they behaved in ways that the established powers disapproved. And so that's really where the idea of sanctions comes from. That's the idea of how sanctions were originally supposed to work.
But isn't there a sense that over time they have become overutilized, specifically in the United States case? I mean, my argument in the previous conversations I've had with people on the show, for example, is that you have diplomacy as one option, or on the opposite end, full-scale military coercion. And so often the US or others will gravitate towards economic warfare because it's less costly and risky for citizens than military warfare or kinetic warfare, but simply doing diplomatic means is not possible. Is that a bit of a simplistic interpretation?
Well, I think if you go back half a century to the time of the Cold War, sanctions were the exception. There were sanctions in operation. The West operated trade controls with communist countries. There were also the first attempts to try to bring about domestic reform in the case of the white racist regimes in Southern Africa by imposing sanctions upon them. But these were not undertaken as a matter of course. They were fairly exceptional. And now there are literally thousands more sanctions in place than ever there were even just a few years ago. They're directed at most of them at a small group of countries: Russia, Iran, North Korea, and so on. The candidates are quite easy to identify. Just as some people worry about America becoming involved in forever wars, others worry about forever sanctions because they're easily adopted, hard to get rid of, and it's unclear what effect they have. So it's become a big problem. I mean, we can go into every aspect of that in more detail if you wish, but I think that's my first attempt at an answer.
Your initial response, indeed, it's not an easy question, but I guess, I would reframe it and expand on it a little bit by simply saying, what makes sanctions work and how do we define success? Is it often regime change, military retreat, in the case of what a lot of people want with Russia, eventual economic collapse, or the removal of Putin as the despot? How do we see sanctions being successful? In some courses that I took at Johns Hopkins, the argument was simply behavioral change, but that's a very, again, quite ambiguous sort of metric, right? So how do you define success with sanctions?
Well, to some extent, it's not for me to define success. It's for those who impose them to define success. And part of the problem is that sanctions may not always be adopted for a material effect, but simply to send a message, whether it's a message to the adversary or a message to one's own voters or constituents. I think it's also the case that sanctions are often adopted as a means of not having to do other things. In a crisis, there's often pressure to do something, and the alternative to sanctions often appear worse. For example, to go to war, to commit troops into a conflict that you don't know what the outcome will be. So sanctions seem like a safe alternative. And I think much of the escalation of sanctions in recent years, the multiplication and increasing complexity arises from the fact that people in power tend to regard them as a sort of cheaper or less risky alternative. So they've become the first resort in a crisis.
But isn't that an essence of laziness, arguably? How can we look at history and illustrate that countries have largely adapted to sanctions? I grant you, in some regards, that there's almost a sensationalism. Well, maybe you won't use that word, but you could argue there's a certain sensationalism around sanctions because they're often the ones that are most often touted in the media and cited as sort of being failed aspects of economic policy. So can you illustrate the best or biggest examples where sanctions have worked, but also where they don't seem to work?
Well, you said at the beginning that you'd like to get onto the subject of Russia and Ukraine eventually, but since it's probably something that's relatively fresh and refer to it now, if you look at the run-up to the present conflict, there were sort of 7 or 8 years of a relatively low-level conflict between Russia and Ukraine, in which the West was gradually increasing the level of sanctions it was imposing on Russia, and then war broke out. And in the run-up to war, Western leaders found themselves facing the rising probability that there was going to be a catastrophic conflict, that Russia was going to initiate a full-scale invasion, and the best thing that they could think of was to threaten more and more sanctions, which clearly did not in the end deter Russia from going to war. So if you look at what was propelling both the resort to sanctions and the reliance on sanctions in the run-up to a very critical moment, I think probably there are two things that are important to bear in mind. And one is misunderstanding of what can be expected from sanctions. And if you look at the history of sanctions and of economic warfare generally, one of the most consistent features is exaggerated expectations of the speed with which they will work. And if you look at both the press reports and the subsequent gathering of evidence from Western leaders in the sort of 2020, 2021, as the threat of war became more and more apparent, you find the language of imposing crushing sanctions upon Russia, threatening Russia with catastrophic economic consequences, and so on and so forth, and essentially trying to use sanctions as a means of crisis management, for which I think in general they're very ill-suited. Because the one thing that we know and we find confirmed time and again is that their effect is relatively slow. When economic sanctions are adopted or economic measures, there are many lags in the process. and many twists and turns along the way before you start to see an effect. The other thing, though, which I think is also important, is that by and large, Western nations live in democracies, and voters in democracies are not keen on starting wars. And it's very hard, I think, to be a leader of a democracy, to deliver the unpopular message that war may be coming and we must prepare. That might be the alternative to pulling the sanctions out of the chest of drawers. But it's not a message that is easily accepted by voters. And so you can regard that as a failure of democracy, or you can regard it as a failure of leadership. But I'm confident that it plays a very important role in Western politics in leaders' preference to think about sanctions rather than think about military preparations for conflict.
Oh, that's a fair point. I haven't always considered the element of sanctions, shall we say, like that. That's all, or the role of public pressure, I suppose. What about, therefore, though, I do have one question on what Trump's doing to sort of the US's specific role and influence on sanctions, shall we say, in a second. But what about the inability for there to be consistency in their implementation? What I mean by that is simply, what about the European Union as a case study? Early on, when there was an effort by the European Union to impose sanctions on Russia, quickly there were a lot of concessions made or loopholes by the European Commission because Italy wanted to continue to send certain produce to Russia. Hungary has obviously been a fly in the ointment. So multilateral sanctions particularly can be quite ineffective, no?
I think that our experience of sanctions is that always it's a process. Imposing sanctions is not a single event. It's always a process. It must be a process. And part of the process is understanding the first effects, discovering what is more costly to you than to the adversary, trying to understand how the adversary responds. And one of the things that we find is that the adversary that is the subject of sanctions always has more options than you expect. Just to give an example, lots of people thought, well, we'll deny Russia access to the latest microchips. That'll cripple their defense industry, and it'll be one of a number of measures that will quickly undermine their war effort and cause it to unravel. And then you find that Russia, in fact, has many ways to maintain its supply of microchips, for example, by rerouting trade, by smuggling, by economizing at home. So we live in a sort of technological era when every refrigerator, every motor car has a microchip. Do we always need microchips in our refrigerators? Not really. So, there's plenty of scope there to economize and to switch the uses of microchips from civilian goods to military goods and so on. So the country that is subject to sanctions has many options, many of which should turn out to be unexpected. Indeed, a country that's subject to sanctions has a positive interest in finding the responses that are outside the box that the country imposing the sanctions expected. But the other side of this, I know I'm making it sound as if really there's no point in applying sanctions, and that's not what I think. The point is that all of these stratagems involve costs. Russia has been forced to undertake many adaptations that were less than optimal for its economy, that imposed higher costs in various respects. I mean, simply driving Russia into the hands of China is not an outcome that Putin wanted. It's one that's kept his war economy going, but it's diminished his authority relative to that of the Chinese, and I'm sure that's not what he intended. And so all of these things are costly to Russia, and these costs do accumulate over time. But it's just to accentuate what I said a moment ago, which is the full effect of sanctions is never going to be felt quickly. It's something that accumulates over time if the country imposing them is consistent and monitors the effects and continues to adapt its regime to close off loopholes and to increase pressure. But all that takes time. It takes much more time than people anticipate.
It does, and I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. Equally, again, if sanctions aren't consistently implemented or there's a change in democracy, for example, I think one of the biggest arguments people have about generally economic prosperity in Western countries versus countries that are more autocratic are that, you've got one party that wants one set of policies, and so it's these electoral cycles that can affect the policy making, and that includes sanctions, right? Would you agree with such an assessment or not?
I think what you're describing is one of the costs of political polarization. We've moved from an era of broad consensus in democratic societies to one of polarization. And one of the costs of polarization is that every government that comes in wants to overturn the policies of the previous government. And I think that's very much to be regretted, but it's the world we live in. And it's also one that our adversaries can exploit, as we've seen on numerous occasions. The Russians and the Chinese can see the divisions in our societies and insert their wedges to widen these divisions, and to make our policies less effective. I think historical experience does tell us that when faced with an ultimate emergency, democratic societies can pull together and indeed can then unify around policies and mobilize resources in ways that are superior to those of most autocratic regimes. The problem is that we're not there yet, and the polarization that you're describing has limited our responses, and it is continuing to do so as we look at, for example, the United States, and how the United States is starting to unravel Western sanctions on Russia, for example. I'm sorry, I've completely lost your sound.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute just to make sure there's no background noise. I'm glad you brought up the United States, because we covered Trump an uncomfortably amount of times on this channel, but equally in the context of the war in Ukraine again, because one of the arguments, and I asked this question to Martin Wolf of the FT just yesterday, actually, about the overutilization of sanctions and the weaponization of the dollar. And so this is driving in the global south countries that have an antipathetic, attitude towards the US at the moment, or US hegemonic status. Do you think that we're going to see more and more countries able to circumnavigate sanctions, including Russia, because of what the US has done in its overusage of them?
This will always happen. I mean, in the early months of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion, I was continually reminded of the first months of World War I, when Britain imposed as tight a blockade as it could upon German ports in order to intercept shipments bound for Germany from outside. And at the same time, there was a big increase in British trade with Netherlands, with Sweden, countries neighbouring Germany that were in a position of neutrality. And in fact, what Germany was doing was simply rerouting its trade through neutral countries, and if possible onto neutral or even British ships to get through the blockade of the North Sea. So the kind of rerouting of Russian trade through Turkey and India and Kazakhstan and China that we saw in the opening stages of Russia's war on Ukraine is really nothing new. But the important thing to remember is that rerouting isn't perfect. It's a cost. It's not something that Russia wanted to do. It's something that Russia had to do. And the resources that were devoted to rerouting Russia's trade were resources that could not then be used for war. So forcing the adversary to undertake countermeasures and to defend itself against economic warfare isn't a difficulty. It's the point of economic warfare, of sanctions. It's raising the cost to the adversary of pursuing the adversary's objectives. And it's to be expected. And that's what we should aim, the purpose should be.
Right, I see. So in your mind, what would be a more effective sanction strategy against Russia? Is there one that we should be employing still and haven't done? Is the European Union's lack of coherency an issue here, or it's overstated? And what do you think is should we say, are we missing a strategic pairing of better military or diplomatic pressure, for example?
Okay, so you're asking what else we should be doing than what we're doing already, right? And I don't see, I think the sanctions regime that's in place is very important, and it can continue to be tightened in small ways as we see the loopholes. Every loophole needs attention. Secondary sanctions should be tightened. One of the most important things that can tighten the sanctions regime is not any particular sanction, but something psychological. And that is commitment. I would ask you to put yourself in the position of a third party, a trader in one of these countries on Russia's borders that is contemplating a deal with Russia that will earn $1 million this year, but then lead to that trader being sanctioned and thereby excluded from the American-dominated global economy. Okay, imagine that. And think what calculation that trader has to make, right? Should I get this shipment of microchips to Russia, or should I stick with the sanction rules, give up that $1 million? And the thing is, if that trader is thinking, well, look, I can make $1 million and then I will never be able to trade again in the Western part of the world, that's a big sacrifice. So that trader will be more likely to adhere to sanction rules. Whereas if that trader thinks, I can make $1 million this year, and next year sanctions will be over, I'll be forgiven, I'll be let back into the global economy, the price I pay will just go away, then why adhere to sanction rules? And so it's that sense of commitment that the countries imposing sanctions are in this for the long term and will pursue sanctioned entities indefinitely is very important. And that's why backsliding is so destructive. The backsliding that has taken place is minimal. It's allowing Hungary to make a deal with Rosatom to build a nuclear power station. That's what was announced the other day. I may be wrong, but as I understand it, that's the first significant step back from American step back from sanctions. And that's a signal. It's a signal to everybody. Sanctions may not be there for much longer. You know, America isn't necessarily going to pursue you to the ends of the earth if you break the sanction rules. So the psychological effect of that on the decisions that people make today about whether to forego the profits they could make from trading with Russia, that's very, very important. So maintaining commitment is very important. Sorry, this is a rather long answer now, because there's something else I want to say that's also very important. What else should we be doing other than what we're doing already? And the other thing is military pressure has to complement the economic pressure. The pressure that we place upon Russia by supplying Ukraine with weapons forces Russia to commit resources to the fighting front that it cannot then make available in the economy. And so that accentuates the effect of sanctions. The military aid to Ukraine increases the effects of sanctions. So the West, if it wants Ukraine to win, it has to come at Russia from both angles, from the angle of sanctions and also the angle of increasing the military pressure upon Russia. So that's where, you know, the stoppage of American military supplies to Ukraine, whether it's not clear at the moment whether it's temporary or permanent, that's so important as well, because it's demoralizing. It's demoralizing for Ukraine. It's heartening for the people in the Kremlin. It makes them think, yes, we can tough out these sanctions because Ukraine will not be able to maintain its forces in the front line. So we have to think of the effect of sanctions and of military aid to Ukraine at the same time. They're not completely separate. They're both part of what we have to be doing.
Yes, absolutely. You know, as we record this, the Russians are scaling up more and more their strikes across Ukraine, and I think they're ramping up. They're able to fire over 1,000 missiles and drones in a single night even, which is not something I think the Ukrainians have the sustainability to constantly intercept or to push back against. But that's the problem with sanctions, isn't it? Because they're very slow burning and they have to be therefore used in combination with many other things. And, you know, as you say, if left in place long enough, then they can have a lasting impact and eventually be lifted if the country comes round, such as we're seeing with Syria. At the moment, I believe the Trump administration have lifted sanctions and already we're seeing a huge amount of inflows of FDI and such. So I guess my last question for you really, Mark, would be sort of what would you really want listeners, viewers to take away from our conversation today?
Well, if you want to understand sanctions, two things are important. One is they have to have time to work. And 3 years after the outbreak of war, the Russian economy is hurting. It's not collapsing, but it's hurting. And it's hurting because of sanctions and because of the need to divert for Russia to take resources out of the economy and put them into the front line. But it takes time. A lot of people thought, sanctions will cause the Russian economy to collapse overnight. That was never going to happen. It never has happened. It never will happen. But after 3 years, the Russian economy is hurting. But the other thing is that for sanctions to have their full effect, they have to be complemented by other policies, and particularly by military pressure, which the West can help to increase on Russia. There's this, people talk about hybrid war, which is a new name for a very old idea, that war works best when you do everything at once. And in this case, it means don't think of sanctions on their own. Think of sanctions in the context of the pressure on the adversary by other means, political, diplomatic, and also military. And only if you see sanctions as a complement to military power, not as a substitute for it. There's very little evidence that sanctions on their own ever achieved anything much. But when sanctions are complemented by the exercise of power in other dimensions, that's when they start to have a more powerful effect.
Quite the pertinent point to end on. Mark Harrison, Emeritus Professor of Warwick University here in the UK. Thank you very much for your time, and everyone else for watching. If you enjoyed the conversation, then do check out Mark's work. He writes some fantastic pieces. They'll be in the description, and do subscribe and follow for more conversations like these as we try to break down the very complicated things you see in mainstream media and dissect exactly what each bit means and bring it all together into conversations like these. But we'll see you all next time.